Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Well here. The Trials of Reckoning event is wrapping up this week, and as you might have seen in the Mog Shop, the recipes for the Wind Spear are there, which is a spear that newer players may not have had access to, or older players may not have farmed enough recipes at the time of release. So this is going to be a little actual damage calculation infographic about how you compare the Wind Spear versus the Stoss Spear, and really when you decide when the Stoss Spear is optimal and whether or not you should really farm for this Wind Spear if you have the Stoss one instead. Phew, that was a mouthful. But if we're getting into things, just a general spear overview. So what I've got on the screen here in a moment is just the MR and UR rated spears that are non-TMR. So basically, what are the ones that you can farm the recipes for by and large? And so the Wind Spear is one of them that's being featured this week. The second one is the Stoss Sphere, which was run when Aranea came out with Final Fantasy 15, and then there's a variety of other spears here that are unique to the elements in terms of giving extra modifiers. There's earth, ice, lightning. The Dragon Killer is literally just if you're facing dragons. Ignore that one for the sake of argument. So it was really 5 spears in general here. When you're comparing the damage potential of the Wind Spear versus the ones on the bottom for the characters that can use those elements, the answer will almost always be that the character will get more damage out of their elemental spear than the Wind Spear. Almost always. The modifier on that is just too high. But if you look at a character like Kain, begs the question, when is the Wind Spear better than the Stoss Spear? We have some calculations here. So if you're looking at the comparison right off the bat here, the Wind Spear and the Stoss Spear has essentially have one very unique thing each about them. The Wind Spear gives you 5 agility, which is really critical. The Stoss Spear gives you 10% pierce resistance penetration, which is completely different in terms of damage output. For the sake of argument, we're not even going to look at the vital build on the Wind Spear. Please do not waste your resources on that. But when you're comparing the rest of them, if you're asking the question, maxing attack, which one is better for maxing your attack stat? Well, I think they're about equal. I don't think there's a material difference between 176 and 168. If you ask the question, how do you max your accuracy stat? Honestly, I still say they're about the same. 18% is not much lower than 21%. That's just a 3% chance less to hit. So that's roughly equivalent for the purposes of functional theory. Which one's better to max your critical hit rate? Well, they're both identical. 15 on the crit builds and 3 on the others, so both identical. When you max agility, the Wind Spear has 5 agility. The Stoss Spear has no other stats. It's got 5 stats versus the Wind Spear 6. So if the Wind Spear Assault is equal to the Stoss Spear Assault, and the Wind Critical is equal to both the Stoss Aim or Critical, begs the question, the Wind Spear is better? Question mark? Well, situationally so. The thing we're leaving out here is the pierce resistance penetration. And if we're to graph that, did a damage calculation here, the assumptions of which are on the top right, but basically I had Kain use Brain Piercer ability and observe the damage across different levels of pierce resistance here. And the general takeaway, and this is Assault build versus Assault build, is that the Wind Spear will do more damage than the Stoss Spear, up to about 35% enemy pierce resistance. So enemies that have 35% pierce resistance, the damage is about equal. Enemies that have less, the Wind Spear is going to do more damage. But enemies that have more than 35% is where the Stoss Spear's penetration starts to exceed the Wind Spear's damage. So the general takeaway, if you're talking about the assault builds, is that the point of inflection there, or the point of intercept, 35%, is basically your break point of where you decide one versus the other. So if you need to do some seriously heavy tank busting for tanks that have much higher than 35% pierce resistance, well, Stoss Spear is probably a better bet for Kain than the Wind Spear is, provided you don't need that agility. But there's 2 other builds here, right? We're talking about the critical builds. Well, if we actually just look at the Wind critical build, because me personally, I think having the extra accuracy and crit rate are worth the trade-off in Assault. If we were to compare the Stoss Spear, the Assault, the highest possible attack, versus the Wind Spear's critical build, the one that gives the accuracy and critical, that breakpoint obviously becomes a little bit less. So around that 18-20%, we'll round up to 20%, is when the Stoss Spear starts to do more damage. But the trade-off is the Wind Spear gives you a higher critical hit rate and more accuracy. So that's one of those things that begs the question. But overall, there's not a massive drop-off in damage, in my opinion, between the crit builds of the Wind Spear and the assault builds of the Stoss Spear. But let's go one step further. We mentioned all those elemental spears earlier, so in a completely different situation here, if you took Aranea versus just a regular old enemy with only the Ice Spear equipped, You say ask the same question. Where is it? And my line is wrong here. Good lord. You ask the question. Where does the Stoss Spear start to do more damage than the Ice Lance? And it's basically about the 55% mark. I don't know why my line is so far off here, but basically about 55% is where the Stoss Spear. Now that's incredibly high. And to be honest, most characters, most tanks in the game don't have more than 60% pierce resistance at any given time. So the odds of encountering an enemy with 70 or 80% where you really need the extra damage is probably pretty low overall. But the general takeaway, the recommendation was the Stoss Spear best? Well, it's about when enemies have more than 60% pierce resistance, in my opinion, which is fairly rare. So when we get back to our initial, thinking of the how good is the Wind Spear, the answer is pretty darn good in most instances, and almost always better than the Stoss Spear when you're talking about practical application, where most enemies are going to be less than 60% pierce resistance, which means the Wind Spear, not only is the 5 agility probably going to give you more value, but you're also going to get relatively more value from the crit rate and the accuracy as well on the critical build. So, this is a very good spear to farm this week. And for those of you that still have tickets and are wondering what to do with your boxes, please make the time to invest in the Wind Spear. It is definitely a very powerful piece of equipment that you're probably going to use for a handful of different scenarios and content and gameplay. So that's everything. Hopefully this is informative, and I'll talk to you all soon.